Dave here again, pastor and shade tree theologian. You see the balloon hanging down right here, that's a leftover decoration from my 67th birthday celebration that the kids came in and put balloons and streamers on my office. So that's what that is from. I wanted to put out another supplement here. And I know that we have talked about this before, or at least I talked about it in one of my sermons, and that is the different views of Revelation. And so I thought I'd go a little bit more in depth on that, just so that you could kind of understand it. And if you've already kind of gone over this, this might not be a video that you want to continue to watch then, or maybe it's good supplemental reading and study on that. But there are different views of Revelation and the way that it is interpreted, and I thought that that we'd take a look at that. They basically are the preterist view and the futurist view, the idealist view, and then also the historical view. And so I want to talk a little bit about this, and then I'll kind of let you know a little bit where I stand with it, and you may agree with me and may not. And so that's okay too. Keep in mind that the interpretation of Revelation is very subjective and objective, I guess, to a certain extent. It kind of depends on who you talk to, and I'm not pushing my views on you, but I understand it one way, and you might understand it a different way. And there's a lot of people out there that say a lot of different things, and so I wanted to kind of go into it a little bit. The preterist view teaches that most of the events in the book of Revelation were fulfilled in the first century, and especially in the destruction of Jerusalem at 70 AD. And so they looked at it that when John was writing this, and remember John wrote it in AD 95, so 20 years after the destruction of the temple, they looked at it like all of these things were taking place at that point, and it wasn't in the future. It was in the preterist or the preterist view. And so in that particular thing, they see that the persecution, of course, are the Christians in the Roman Empire. And the beast is often identified as Nero or Domitian or maybe Caligula or someone like that. And it is, in the preterist view, Revelation is seen as a message of hope to the early believers facing immediate suffering. Now, we understand that the first couple of chapters, when Jesus was talking to the churches in Asia, Ephesus and Philadelphia and Smyrna and Thyatira and all those were actual churches that were in existence at that time, and those letters were to that. But the preterist view, Revelation 4 through about 22, is to them all of that taking place in the first century. And so that's kind of how they believe that. I'm not sure exactly how they get to all of the brimstone that came from heaven and the abyss opening up and, all of that. I'm not quite sure on that, but that is their view on that. Now, the futurist view holds that most of Revelation, especially chapters 4 through 22, describe events that have not yet happened. And that is kind of the view that I kind of lean toward a little bit more, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. These include a future tribulation, the rise of the Antichrist, global judgment, the return of Christ. And remember, in our teachings, we talk about the rapture, we talk about the return of Christ and the differences there. So let me just go over it again. With the rapture, the saints are caught up to meet Jesus in the air. Dead in Christ rise first. This is in Thessalonians. Dead in Christ rise first, and then we who are alive and remain are caught up to meet the Lord in the air. At the second coming of Christ, this is later on in Revelation, this is when he comes back with the multitude of saints, who I believe are us, that have been raptured. And he will come back, and that's when when he actually touches down on earth, and that'll be when the Battle of Armageddon is, and that type of thing. So in the futuristic view, especially chapters 4 through 22, with the futuristic view, these things have not happened yet. And so we see Revelation as a prophetic roadmap to the end times still to come. So that's a little bit about the futurist view. And I'll go more into these in just a minute here, but wanted to just kind of hit the highlights of it. The idealist view, or sometimes they will call it the symbolic or the timeless view, this interprets Revelation as a timeless spiritual drama rather than specific historical events. So they believe that this is an ongoing thing, and it's all in the spirit, and it is all analogy, it's all simile, it's all symbology. And so it portrays the ongoing battle between good and evil, Christ and Satan, throughout all of the times of history. The symbols representing recurring patterns of persecution and faithfulness and ultimate victory in every generation. And so that's what they kind of call the ideal view, or the idealist view on that. And then they also, there's another one here that is the historical view. Let me get to that, or the historic view, historist. The historist view understands Revelation as a timeline of church history from the first century to the return of Christ. And the events and the symbols correspond to different of the historical periods, such as the rise and the fall of the empires of the church movements, and many historic interpretations identified the beast with corrupt religious or political systems, often associating with the medieval church and the institutions of the papacy. And so that would be more of the historist view on that. So that those are just kind of in a nutshell what those four views are as we're going to looking at that. Now, what I want to do is I want to explore them a little bit more, kind of go a little bit more in depth on that, but that was just kind of a highlight of those four views there. Now, when we talk about these different views, I want to talk just a little bit about the origin of these views and kind of where they've come from for your study and all too. So with the preterist view, most or all of Revelation was fulfilled in the first century, so the Roman world. And talked a little bit about right around the destruction of the temple, which was AD 70, when the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem and didn't basically leave one stone on another. The early hints of this view appear in church history, but it was more fully systemized during the 16th and the 17th century. So the preterist view kind of was a little bit more major at that point. And so the major early proponent of this was Luis de Alcazar. And that was about 1554 to 1630. And he was a Spanish Jesuit. And he wrote Vestiatio Arcani, Census in Apocalypse. This was about 1640. And he was arguing Revelation was primarily referred to the fall. It primarily referred to the fall of Jerusalem and the early church struggles. And this is kind of where this origin, the preterist view, came in. So it went ahead and emerged during the Counter-Reformation as a response to Protestant claims that the papacy was the Antichrist. And so they felt like the Pope back then was the Antichrist and was, propagating all this destruction and all because they were, taking control of the religious sects of different people and things. And so by placing Revelation in the past, it removed its application to contemporary church structures when they did that. Now, with modern forms, there is a partial preterism, and most events are fulfilled, but Christ's return is still in the future. And so they feel like all of the things that are in Revelation have already been done. It's been done through history and all the persecution and all of those types of things up until the return of Christ, and the return of Christ has not come up yet. So that's partial preterism. Now, full preterism, all prophecy, including Christ's return, already was fulfilled. And this is very much in a minority view. There's not a lot of people that believe this, of course. And so that's, that's kind of a little bit about that. And that is the full preterism view on that. And I kind of see some fallacies in Scripture against that, of course. I'm hoping that the Lord hasn't already returned, because if that's the case, then you and I are left behind and we're still here. So, hopefully that's not it. But anyway, that is a little bit of the origin of the preterist view of kind of where it came from. Now, number 2, the futurist view, the end time fulfillment. The core idea is that most of Revelation, chapters 4 through 22, describe future events, a coming tribulation, Antichrist, and then Christ returns. Early seeds appeared in the early church. Some expected a future Antichrist to come in, but the full system developed a little bit later. A key figure in this futuristic view, or the futurist view, was Francisco Ribera, and he lived 1537 to 1591. And he wrote a futurist interpretation placing the Antichrist in the distant future. The core context of this origin also arose during the Counter-Reformation, countering Protestant historic claims. And this shifted the focus away from identifying current institutions like the papacy as prophetic fulfillments. And so the futurist view did not believe that the Pope was the Antichrist and the papacy was, part of the Antichrist world system and all of that. Later expansion of this got popularized in the 19th century through some of dispensationalism, especially via John Nelson Darby, and we talked a little bit about him early, the dispensationalists and all. And it spread widely in the U.S. through the Scofield Reference Bible in 1909. And so that's kind of where it really started to pick up speed and gain some traction there. It is dominant in many evangelical circles today, of course, and shapes popular teachings about the rapture, about the tribulation, about the Antichrist. I lean a little bit more toward that view, in that kind of the futurist view that these things are going to be taking place in the future. Now we have the historist view unfolding through church history. That core idea came from the belief that Revelation is a continuous timeline of history from the apostolic age to Christ's return. Okay? This developed gradually in the early church, but became dominant in the Middle Ages and the Reformation. Strongly embraced by the reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, though Calvin did not write a Revelation commentary. John Calvin thought that Revelation should not even be in the canon at all. And if you can believe it, Martin Luther didn't like Revelation either. Didn't see the symbolism of Christ in it, is kind of what he said, that it wasn't a book about Jesus. Not exactly sure why he thought that. And of course, Martin Luther is much smarter than me, but when I get to heaven and I can sit down and talk to him, I will ask him, why didn't you think Revelation should be there? The Reformers used this viewpoint to interpret Revelation as describing church history, especially the corruption in Rome. And so the beast and the Antichrist were often identified with the institution of the papacy. Of course, that would follow because Martin Luther hammered his edict on the door of the chapel there in Germany, basically, and began the Reformation. And so I could kind of see how that would kind of follow their interpretation of that. They also believe, this is still the historist view, that the seals, the trumpets, the bowls corresponded to historical events, like the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, medieval churches, that type of thing. And they also believe that Revelation is read like a prophetic timeline unfolding across the centuries, with that historist view. And that view is less common today, but it's still held in some Protestant traditions. Just kind of depends on that. Now, the idealist view is a timeless spiritual reality. They believe that Revelation is not tied to specific historical events, but represents ongoing spiritual truths, like the battle between Christ and evil. And its roots go back to the early church thinkers like Augustine of Hippo. And this was 354 to 430. And so St. Augustine thought that this was kind of the way that Revelation unfolded. So he emphasized symbolic and spiritual interpretations over literal timelines. And I think we could probably see a correlation on that with some of that. But I still kind of hold to the belief personally, that it's futuristic type of a thing. It was developed in contrast to overly literal or date-specific readings and focused on the theological message rather than the historical mapping on that. The beast represents reoccurring oppressive powers throughout history, of course. Babylon represents the worldly system who was opposed to God. And Revelation speaks of every generation, not just one. And so you can kind of see how it is that they kind of bring that along there. It's common in a lot of academic and theological circles to hold to this view. And they often combine it with other views, especially in certain pastoral teaching and all too. So just to kind of to recap that kind of in a big picture comparison a little bit, the preterist view was in the past. It was the first century. Origin context was Counter-Reformation, and the emphasis was Rome and the early church. Then if you look at the historist view or historical view, it spans across history. The origin context was the Reformation, and the key emphasis is church history and the timeline of church history as it goes through that. The futurist view holds to the future as being the end times. It is counter-Reformation and modern evangelicalism, and the key emphasis is, of course, the final events that are coming up. The idealist view are timeless. The time focus is timeless. The origin content is the early church with Augustine. And the key emphasis there is spiritual symbolism. And so each view kind of answers a different question. Like the preterist view, what did this mean to the original audience as we're studying the book of Revelation and as we're reading it to them? The historist view, how was this unfolding through history? The futurist view, what will happen at the end or in the end times? The idealist view, what does this mean for all believers for all time? And so, you can kind of kind of look at that just a little bit there with that. Now, it's kind of interesting also that we can kind of map this to Revelation 13, because Revelation 13 is kind of what we've been talking about. So let's look at this real quick here. So if we think of these different views in context of Revelation 13, that's kind of what we're looking at. So if we look at the preterist view, this teaches that most of the events in the book of Revelation were fulfilled in the first century, especially in the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and Roman persecution. And so what's happening there is that that as it's looking at that, it's looking at the beast, of course, as Nero. So in that particular case, we have to ask the question, if you are going by the preterist view of interpretation, then who or what is the Antichrist? Well, of course, the first century thought that Nero Caesar was. Then later on, they said that Domitian was. They said also that Caligula was. And so when we look at the Antichrist or the system of the Antichrist, the preterist view in Revelation 13 would hold that Nero was the Antichrist and that the Roman imperial power was that kingdom that the Antichrist was setting up. That view also holds that the Antichrist is not primarily a future individual, but a contemporary enemy of the early church at that point with the first century there. And so, when John talks about in 1st and 2nd John, remember that in the video that I did before that the word Antichrist appears there, and the spirit of Antichrist is also there, and we talked about that. And so John says it is the last hour and many antichrists have come. So the preterist view feel like the Antichrist is Nero or Caesar, and that's what the evidence of that is in the first century and also in John's writing there. Revelation addresses real churches facing real persecution, of course, and we know that with Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamos and Thyatira and all those. Those were real churches in the first century. And so the preterists hold that, okay, well, this must be what John is writing about in Revelation in that. And so as it's writing, it also looks at certain indicators that are there within the context of the text, like time indicators, like the word soon or near or this generation, and they kind of hold that there. And so it explains why Revelation mattered immediately to the first readers, as John wrote it in 95 AD. And then this also, if you hold to that view, if you would hold to the preterist view, then of course that is going to avoid endless speculation in the future, which we of course have done for 2,000 years now on that. Okay, so that's kind of a couple of the strengths there. They've got the time indicators. They know that Revelation mattered immediately to the readers at that point, and then it avoids endless speculation. However, the weaknesses, some feel that it limits the book's relevance beyond the first century. So if it was just a letter that God wanted us to read that was just of the first century, people feel in this particular view, then why even read it? If it was just back then, they have all died. The churches basically have all passed away. And so it doesn't have any relevance with the modern church. And that's what it's thinking there. And so they feel like it limits the book's relevance there. And it's less satisfying to those expecting a dramatic end time figure, of course, with that. So that's kind of the preterist view and how it is that it would be viewed in the context of Revelation 13. Another drink here. Okay, now let's look at the futurist interpretation as it looks at it of Revelation 13 again. Okay, so the core idea, most prophecy, especially Revelation 4 through 22, so chapters 4 through 22, refer to events that will occur just before the second coming of Christ. Okay? And so who or what is the Antichrist? Now, this is the futurist view. This is the one that I tend to lean toward, okay, and have pretty much all my life. When we're talking about this, we're talking about a future literal individual, someone who is going to rise in power. And I've only put out one of the supplements, part 1 of the Antichrist, and I'm going to do some more. And of course, also the Mark of the Beast and all, because there's just not enough time for me to cover it in my teachings on Saturday night. And so the futurists, or the futurist view, believe that the Antichrist is a future literal individual. Okay, he is often described as a global political leader. He is somebody who will come on the scene and he will establish world peace, at least for the first 3.5 years. So there will be somebody who rises to knit everyone together at that point. He will be a charismatic leader, but he will be a charismatic deceiver. Okay, and he is one who enforces worship and economic control using the mark of the beast. We're going to talk about the Antichrist. We're going to talk about the second beast, which is basically going to be more of a spiritual global leader. But this one is more of a charismatic global leader in that. And he's going to enforce worldwide worship. He's going to unify it with one unified church and unified economic control. And of course, with that is going to come in the mark of the beast, when the Bible talks about you can neither buy nor sell without this mark. Okay. The textual emphasis on this is Daniel's little horn, which I believe is about Daniel 7, somewhere around there. And we may talk about that a little bit more. 2 Thessalonians 2, Paul calls him the man of lawlessness. And then, of course, in Revelation 13, he's called the beast. And he is the Antichrist at that point. Okay. The strengths to this futurist view is that it takes the prophetic symbolism literally and sequentially as we kind of move through Revelation, and as I've been teaching you, we've kind of moved through systematically on that, and we've been talking at this point about the seals and then trumpets and then the bowls, and those are progressive judgments. We've already been through the seals, we've already been through the trumpets, and then in the next couple of weeks we will go into the bowls, and that is the most horrendous of the judgment of God that's being poured out. Okay. It also, the futurist view fits modern expectations of global systems and technologies. We're going to talk more about technology and how that figures in. And it's very influential in popular teaching and media, of course, is the future and Armageddon and the destruction of the world and the Antichrist and the mark of the beast and one world government and, all of those type of things. Of course, weaknesses. Whenever you have the strengths, you always have the weaknesses. And one of the big weaknesses, you probably have already guessed, that there have been hundreds of failed predictions. And I've talked about that at length. And so that is a weakness of the futurist view. It is often driven by current events rather than context. So every time, almost every time a war comes up in the Middle East, everybody wonders, okay, well, is this it? Is this, now we're going to see the Antichrist rise to power and, forget about the rapture. If you're not pre-trib rapture, you think, okay, well, this is going to be the rise of the Antichrist. We're going to see all of this and wars breaking out in the Middle East again. And just to let you know, and something that I've said for a long, long time, there has always been war in the Middle East from the time of Rome forward. And so, that speculation of the current events rather than context is always there. There's always with that. And of course, another one of the weaknesses, and this is something that I've really tried to stress in all of my teaching, is this type of futurist view can foster a lot of fear. And I don't want you to be fearful. I don't want you to be afraid of these type of things. I believe that we as the church, that we are going to be raptured, we're going to be taken out of this, and we're not going to see the tribulation. We're not going to go through the judgment of God. All kinds of contexts and scriptures that I believe back that up personally. And of course, there's scriptures that back up other people's views too, so I'm not poo-pooing anybody there. But I realize that this type of thing can always foster fear, and people are afraid of that. And I really have strived through all of my teaching to tell you not to be afraid of these things, that God didn't put this in the Bible, and that he didn't have John write Revelation for us to be afraid of that. And so the futurist view can foster fear. It can foster a lot of speculation. Of course it does. Some of the things that I tell you is just speculation. It's my speculation. It's things that I've studied. It's things that I've heard. It's other people's speculation, all of that. And of course it can foster date setting, which we have seen over and over and over again. I'm 67 years old, been a Christian all my life. I've seen all the date setters up until this point come and go. Somebody eventually is going to get it right. However, as I tell everybody, if they're going to get it right, who are they going to tell? If somebody predicts that the rapture is going to take place tomorrow, and then the rapture happens, and they are still left here on earth, first of all, they must not have been as close to the Lord as they should have been. Are they going to run around and tell people, see, I predicted it right. All these people are gone, and I predicted it, right? Or if the person predicts that the rapture is going to take place tomorrow, and it does, and they end up in heaven, are they going to run all around heaven and say, see, I told you so, I was right? I think at that point, nobody's going to care. Just my speculation again, okay? But anyway, that's a little bit of the futurist view on that. Now, the idealist view, or the symbolic and theological interpretation, this has to do, again, Revelation 13. Revelation is not about a one-time period, but about ongoing spiritual conflict between Christ and evil throughout history. So again, who or what is the Antichrist? The idealists don't believe that the Antichrist is actually a person. They believe that it is a reoccurring pattern down through history. So any system or ideology or leader or movement that opposes Christ or mimics Christ falsely or demands allegiance that belongs to God is the Antichrist. We saw that through history. We saw Rome do it. We saw Nazi Germany do it. We've seen it in China. We've seen it in all kinds of different things of systems and people demanding allegiance. And so the idealist view believes that, of course, would be the Antichrist. It's not just one person, but it's a reoccurring pattern that's happening through history. And they go back, and of course they would cite 1 John 2:18 that says many antichrists are in the world. And the beast is an imagery of archetypal evil throughout history. And so that Revelation is not a timetable, but it's just a pastoral encouragement to those pastors and to those who are with the churches at Ephesus and Philadelphia and Smyrna and Pergamum, all those. Okay, and so it's an encouragement to pastors who pastor any churches down through the ages of those things. And so that's kind of what the idealist view believes with that. So that would explain why every generation sees an antichrist. And those people who have risen to different types of power and all, and they saw them as antichrist. in that. Okay. This also keeps Revelation relevant across all the eras if you believe this particular view. That's another strength. So one of the strengths is that every generation has an Antichrist, and all of Revelation is relevant across all the eras. It also emphasizes discipleship and faithfulness and endurance. And I believe that so many of these views can still emphasize that. When we read the book of Revelation, definitely it can emphasize the discipleship, the faithfulness, the endurance of the people throughout all the ages, even till now. The weakness is it is less concrete for those wanting precise fulfillment, okay, and can feel too abstract or too literal-minded readers. So it's too abstract to literal-minded readers on that. So that's kind of the way that those kind of go down through that a little bit. So let me see. So, for instance, just looking at this, just as I'm kind of wrapping up this little section here, the preterist would say, what did this mean then? The futurists would say, what's it going to look like later? The idealists, how does this challenge us now? And so, so those are a couple of things there to kind of look at in that. Let me see. Okay, so just real briefly, let me just kind of recap. I know this one's getting a little bit long here. But when we're looking at this in the context of Revelation 13, the preterist view, remember that is going to be the past to the first century fulfillment. The beast is the Roman Empire or Nero rising out of the sea, specifically Nero. The seven heads, of course, would be the Roman emperors that are there. The mortal wound would be Nero's death and the mythical return of him, because they thought that he came back to life. The mark of the beast was likely a coded reference to Nero using the Hebrew gematria, which we're going to talk in another video about the gematria, about the coding there. And some people have put Nero's name as 666, and some people have put it as 616, and we'll talk more about that. Of course, Revelation 13 describes a real persecution under Rome and sends the message of endurance to early Christians suffering under the imperial power. So again, that's kind of re-emphasizing how it looks with Revelation 13. So that's the preterist view. Now the historist view, unfolding through church history, the beast is long-term religious political system, often identified as the medieval church system, especially the papacy. The beast represents corrupt institutional power over the centuries. The mark of the beast is seen as a false religious authority that's enforcing allegiance, sometimes tied to practices or traditions or systems replacing biblical truth. And Revelation 13 unfolds gradually across history, is what they believe in this view, highlighting spiritual corruption, abuse of power, and persecution within Christendom. Okay, so that's going to be the historist view. The futurist view, and I'm wrapping this up, future end time fulfillment, and that is the beast is the future Antichrist, individual leader, a coming global ruler, empowered by Satan, establishes the political and economic and religious control. The mark of the beast is a literal or technological mark of the system required for buying and selling. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about the mark of the beast. Global worship and control, a one-world system enforcing allegiance. Severe persecution of believers during the tribulation. And Revelation 13 is a warning about a future global crisis before Christ returns. Okay, so that's the futurist view. The idealist view, timeless spiritual reality. So remember that. The beast is a recurring evil empire systems, not one person or event, represents any power that opposes God, including governments and ideologies and cultures that demand ultimate allegiance. The mark of the beast is symbolized as a spiritual compromise, choosing the world system over God. And so Revelation 13 happens again and again in every age. And it's a call to faithfulness under pressure, no matter what the era is. Okay? So those are kind of the different views there. And I know that you hear those terms a lot if you're studying Revelation, and I wanted to make them a little bit more clear, and I've run a little bit longer than I really wanted to. But hopefully those views kind of helped you a little bit as we continue our study in Revelation, and I've got more supplemental material coming, so stay tuned. See you then.